Welcome to Growing Pains, a podcast of the Sumner County Republican Freedom Caucus. I'm your host, Deanne DeWitt. Today's guest is a gentleman who has inspired generations, an individual who has had a leadership voice in Tennessee, especially in these last many years where we have experienced surging national reputation and growth. And he has a lot to share. So thank you for being with us, John DeBerry.
Thanks for having me with you, Deanne. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I am excited for this conversation. We've kind of had a near miss a few times, and I haven't been able to sit in your presence until this very moment, and so it's distinctly an honor for me. I'll give a little bit of background for our listeners. You have had a career that has spanned everything from civil rights activism and political courage, resounding faith. You served in the Tennessee State Legislature for 26 years, which is there's a lot to talk about there, and so we'll kind of circle back and talk about those years. But you have led to a role now that you are serving as senior advisor to Governor Lee.
Yes.
And so let's just kind of summarize some of that. Talk about your leadership, your natural-born leadership skills, and how you view those in this current circumstance.
Well, I don't know about natural born. I have had the opportunity of having and the privilege and blessing of having parents who were very good leaders. My father was an individual who was a minister, who was a soldier, who was the civil rights activist. He drugged me around as a young teenager. I followed him and learned from him during those particular and turbulent times in our country. So my leadership abilities come from watching a generation of people who knew that the world had to change, the country had to change, and that they had to be the change agents. And this is an incredible generation. We're losing many of them every day. My father and mother are both gone from this world. But I feel as though what I am and what I became, it's because of their courage, their determination, their leadership, and their patriotism. They loved this country, and they loved it enough to make the sacrifices that had to be made to make it a better place to live. And so I feel like this gave me the foundation for what I was to become what I am today, and the vantage point that I take and the perception I have of the country, of myself, and of our future, it comes from that foundation. And I am deeply grateful to God for that.
Well, you touched on so many points there that I know I would love to talk about. That courage has definitely defined you, and I know that there was a speech that went viral that really changed the course of your service in the state legislature. Could you share a little bit about what that experience was and what you took from it, what you learned?
Well, because I had followed my father as a teenager and watched him as a younger person leave the family. I've told the story so many times. The family raised money in 1963. My father was our representative of our family to go to Washington, the March on Washington that Dr. King and others spoke on that day. It was a monumental day in the history of our country, I think, because it served notice on that day that the country would never be the same, that the status quo would never be satisfactory, that with the lines of demarcation between white and colored and rich and poor and the educated, the illiterate, that those lines were going to be removed, erased, to the extent that America lived up to its promise, which was part of Dr. King's speech. So, realizing that, I understand that my father taught me that something that was said all the time, if you don't find something that's worth sacrificing for, even dying for, then you don't find anything worth living for. So making that speech on that day, I had all of these things in mind. I heard people referencing the civil rights movement. They were referencing the marches of the 60s. And what they were talking about is a justification of burning buildings, burning classrooms, burning cars, pulling down statues and monuments that have been that represented the history of this country. Folks were talking about the Washington Monument should come down, that the statue of Abraham Lincoln should be. It was a ridiculously crazy time that particular year. And I did not walk on the floor of the House with the intention of making a speech or saying anything that day. As a matter of fact, I had concluded I was going to stay in my seat, keep my mouth closed, and basically get ready for the fight and battle I knew I was going to have to get reelected. But when I heard everything that my father, his generation, and others, the things that they had suffered for, the things that they had sacrificed for, put their life on the line on the Pettus Bridge, the Bloody Sunday, the marches in Memphis, and all over this country, and then have a group of people trivialize it and comparing it to the chaos and anarchy that I was seeing, I was constrained to stand up. I didn't have anything written down. I basically said what was on my mind. I had no idea it had gone viral until someone told me. But the fact is, I said on that day what I believe my dad would say, what Dr. King would have said, what many men and women, black and white, who were there, who put their lives on the line, would have said in that time when we were watching that chaos in our country.
It was a really sobering moment for a lot of us to see how good people were reacting with such emotional outbursts that had no foundation. I can't imagine sitting in your seat and witnessing what was being said, and then walking to the pit there in the state legislature,
well, yeah.
to the well. Thank you, not the pit. Maybe it was a Freudian slip, the pit. But
That's all right.
walking to the well and just letting those words flow. You have. I said this, I think, before we started talking on air, but your wisdom is profound. So as you think of new candidates that are thinking about getting involved in elected office, is there something from that moment and that experience that you would convey about how you represent your values and your virtues and how you speak your vision with courage?
Well, one of the things my father said to me when I was sworn in 1995 for my first term in the House of Representatives, and he had been there. I have a picture of the big smile that was on his face. My grandmother had the opportunity of being there. So the remaining patriarch and matriarch of my family who was still alive were there when I was sworn in. When my father was about to leave Nashville, he said something to me that I have repeated to my children, both of my daughters, one of whom is an attorney, the other is a therapist, but I've said this to both of them. My father said, "You have my name. Don't mess up my name." And that was very important to me, to be John Jefferson DeBerry Jr., and to know the legacy of the man who wore the uniform, who had demonstrated courage, who had raised his family, who had raised me and my brothers and sisters. And we had lost our mother by that time in a car accident. But the fact that he made me reflect and do an introspective examination of myself, to ask myself, why am I here? Why am I here? Why am I on Capitol Hill? Why did I run for office in the first place? Why did I take that oath of office? I had already placed my hand, my grandbaby held the Bible. I had already put my hand on the Bible. I had raised my hand, my daughter rather. I had raised my hand, even though others weren't doing that. And I took that oath of office that was administered that day by Speaker Jimmy Nafee and by those who were in charge of the House. When I took that oath of office, I had to ask myself, why am I here? Only a handful of people had been on that floor, had sat on that floor over the 200-year history of this country. And I realized that I had been blessed. I realized that I'd been given a sovereign responsibility, that it wasn't about me, that it wasn't about my ideas at all. It was about the people I represent, the Constitution, the survival and continuance of the state of Tennessee and the United States of America, and serving the God who had given me that opportunity to sit on that floor. When I realized those things, it became very clear to me. And I think that any young man, woman that wants to serve in public office has to, first of all, understand that it is a service and that the highest title on the planet Earth is that of servant. And when we become servants of our God, of our fellow man, of our country, that's when you really achieve success.
So maybe let's talk a little bit more about that faith and how that faith has, how you balance those spiritual principles and apply that to the realities of public policy.
Well, for 26 years, I served District 90 out of Memphis as a Democrat. And the Democrats of that district, the Republicans of that district, elected me for one reason, not because I leaned to the right or to the left, but because I had conservative values that basically reflected the values of that community. As a matter of fact, when I ran for office, the first people to come to me to inform me that it was open were Republicans. And because the district, that particular District 90 had been Republican, represented by a Republican for, I think, almost 20 years. And it was redrawn to be Democrat. The Republicans and Democrats came to me, asked me to run. Politics at that time was the last thing on my mind. My church, my family, my fledgling business at that particular time, those were the things on my mind. But they convinced me that I was the individual who could build the bridge between the right and the left, between the Republicans, the Democrats, the blacks, the whites, the rich, the poor. My district, District 90, for years was an extremely diverse district, encompassing all of the former that I just mentioned. And so, therefore, it was my conservative values. It was my belief in the inspiration of the scriptures, that God created the world, that God created male and female, that God designed marriage between a male and a female, that God created us male and female. It is not an assignment at birth. These values were taken into consideration in 1994, when the community came to me. So they didn't come to me because I was a Democrat or a Republican. They came to me because I was a man of faith, I was a man of principle, and that I was conservative in my values. And so my faith is the foundation of all of that. When my former party decided that I did not represent them anymore, and basically decertified me and said that I don't represent that party, my friends and my governor and others welcomed me as a Republican because they said that's what you've been all along anyway. Since 2020 rather, as a Republican, I've served Governor Bill Lee as a member of his cabinet. I speak at Republican events all over the country, as well as Democrat events all over the country, because my values are conservative. That means, I know you've heard this before, that it's not the elephant, it's not the donkey, it's the lamb. And when we consider the fact that our values didn't come from either of them, our values come from the scriptures, our values come from God. And then we, as politicians, we decide on how we make those work for the general public. And I think I thank God for that background.
Wow. Well, I thank God for him giving you that background too. And that's it is rare. And so let's talk a little bit about, you've seen decades of cultural change, and you've really just described a lot of what we've seen in recent years and the way that these two parties have sort of reshaped and maybe changed in different ways. But at the heart of that is the opportunity to have civil discourse and have conversations that bring together the common values that the vast majority of all Americans believe in. And so just talk a little bit about the ability to have a conversation without destroying each other. How do we shift and get to that point?
That's strange. I was on a program at I think it's World Outreach with Alan Jackson. He did a faith and family type of program, and that very question was asked of the panel that I was on. You can disagree without becoming disagreeable. The fact is, we have a democracy. People keep talking about saving democracy and destroying democracy, and I'm always wondering, what are you thinking when it was democracy that elected the president? It was democracy that elected the members of the House and the Senate and the Congress and all. We don't have a monarch that took an army and marched into Washington and overtook Washington and marched in the White House and declared himself the ruler. We had an election, and I think people forget that. We had an election, and the man that sits in the White House today, just as the man who sat in the White House before him, were elected by the people. I think that we need to look around the world and understand something, that there are those who don't have the privileges that we have, the blessings that we have. The conversation is going on right now about people in certain countries who are being killed and martyred because of their faith. There are those who don't have the right to speak out. If you were in a totalitarian country, you couldn't march in the street and burn cars and burn the flag and burn people in effigy that people do without thinking twice. Why? Because this is a free country. I think we need to step back a little bit and realize how blessed we are. There had never been a nation like America. When those forefathers and foremothers declared and wrote that Declaration of Independence, that we will be free, I think that a lot of us forget that there were kings in the world at that time with the power of life and death. These men and women wrote a constitution. They fought a revolutionary war. They won their freedom. Nobody ever said that America was perfect. We've got our fears, our faults, our failures, our flaws. But what America did was say, we're going to solve our problems by our faith. That's how we're going to solve our problems. Slavery didn't end because someone got an epiphany. It ended because someone realized that God made all men equal. Where did it come from? It came from our faith.
Right.
The same with women having the rights that they have and changing the Constitution for so many other mistakes that we have made. I tell people all the time, you can't unwrite history. You can't rewrite history. We learn from history so that we can write a better future for this country. And it is only when we realize how blessed we are, how far we have come. America is celebrating its 250th anniversary. But think about that. There are countries with buildings 2,000 years old.
Good point.
Right
Good point.
now.
Sure.
So how is it that America became the most powerful, the most prosperous, the most attractive country on earth? I know where people are trying to get in. I haven't seen the door where folks are trying to get out. And it's because we have been able, by God's blessing, God has blessed America. And Americans by birth could learn something from Americans by choice. Because those men and women who study and raise their hand and take the oath to become an American, I have met some of them. They're some of the most proud people I've ever met, in tears, because they became an American. But
Yeah.
so many of us have lost that. We've lost that. And we've got to find that again.
It's easy to take so many things for granted, but that, I think, what you've touched on is really one of the most important. And certainly, the work that we're doing and the reason we even have this podcast is because these challenges that we're facing, they do require us to take a step back and acknowledge all the good that we have despite the challenges of growth.
Yes,
and so God bless America. And as you said, the door coming in is the one that, people are looking for, not the one to leave. Same is true for Tennessee.
Oh, absolutely.
And God blessed Tennessee. And I think from the vantage point you sit now, working with Governor Lee, are there things that are on the horizon, maybe as it relates to this growth we just touched on, or other initiatives that you think, it's an interesting year, right? When you're a governor and you're in your last year, there's an opportunity. So maybe there's some things on the horizon that you're excited about. Anything that, kind of comes to mind through all that?
As Governor Lee goes into his legacy year, I had the opportunity for the last almost 5 years to work with this man, to pray with him, to watch him go through struggle as his wife battled sickness that everybody knew about, to watch her courage. She encouraged so many of the women at my church who were also battling cancer at that time. And the fact that her headpieces, she would wear her stylish scarves. It gave the women at my church, many of them, so much encouragement watching her. The relevance being, working with Governor Lee over the last 5 years has allowed me to look at the executive side. I'd already worked for 26 years in the legislative side, and we would get in there and duke it out on the floor in committees. But to watch his calm, steady hand as he dealt with issues going all the way back to COVID and other issues, it has helped me to understand a different nuance of leadership as far as the government is concerned. I think that he is still very much concerned about education, making sure that he leaves the education system better than he found it. He is very much concerned about criminal justice. He has worked to reform many of those systems, parole and others. I think he's very much concerned about poverty. One of the things that he says, and I've quoted this all over the country, one of the things he said in one of his State of the State speeches was that here in the state of Tennessee, we cannot guarantee success, but we will guarantee opportunity. And I think that's what we try to do in the state of Tennessee. I think all of us, including yourself, we're all on board in saying everybody ought to have a chance. Everybody should have the opportunity. We can't say what the outcome is going to be, but we most certainly can say you ought to have the shot at success. And I think that that's one of the drivers of his administration. And I'm looking forward to watching what he decides to do in his last year.
Well, we all will. We'll all be looking forward to see what happens in the year ahead. I think as we kind of wrap this up, I know that I've heard you say that leadership means serving others when it costs you personally. Mm-hmm. And you've already touched on what an important role that any of the elected offices that we might talk about. Servant is really the highest order, and that's the most important skill set that we should be looking for. So as you look to the future, really, what keeps you steady as you think about how leadership is part of your DNA and what that might cost you? What do you think about the road ahead?
I've told here again, I feel like I repeat myself so much, but I've told the story so many times, and that I, like anyone else, get frustrated. And I believe I was frustrated, I was tired, I was worn out with the constant bickering and fighting, and that was endless. It's one thing to fight toward a goal and to debate toward a conclusion, and it's another thing to fight just to fight and argue just to argue. I think we'd had one of those days on the floor of the House. I walked out off the floor. I called my wife, who was still with me at that time. She was alive at that time. I lost her in 2015. But I called her and I said, I'm done. I am not running again. I'm not going to run again. And she said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yeah, I'm sure." And I tell people, God got me real good. You know what He did? He gave me grandchildren. And I looked at my grandchildren, and you and I were speaking about our grandchildren a moment ago. And I looked at my grandchildren, and I realized that if my grandchildren are going to enjoy the same blessings, the same benefits, the wonderful country that I grew up in spite of all of its flaws, I wouldn't want to live anywhere other than America and in the state of Tennessee. And I realized that if they were going to have those same blessings, that I need to go back on that floor and do my job. Simple as that. That's where God placed me. Get back on the floor and do your job. And that's what I did. And I thank God for that opportunity. And you mentioned those who might consider running for office. I heard one gentleman tell his constituents one time, because they were holding him accountable for what he promised them when he ran for office and how he was voting now that he was in office, he made this statement, and I'm going to quote him. He said, "Well, I evolved on that issue." And I tell young people all the time, especially if you're going to run for office, folks don't elect you to evolve. They elect you to represent. And if you do not represent their values, their beliefs, their faith, if you don't represent them, then don't run. They didn't send you to evolve. They sent you to represent. And only a few of us get that opportunity. And I thank God so much for having given me that opportunity.
Well, on that note, I think that's a perfect moment to wrap this up and just say thank you, John. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for that that call that you have been given. Gifting is a thing, isn't it? And when God gifts you with a talent and the ability to bring people together, it's priceless. And so we thank you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me today, Deanne. I appreciate it.